All right, so I was out. I don't know how many of you guys were out there. It was a very, very moving ceremony out on the beach in Santa Barbara by Young America's Foundation, which runs the Reagan Ranch Center. And I gave a few remarks, which was very difficult because before I gave these remarks, they had bagpipe playing, which was just absolutely heartbreaking. I was afraid I was just going to get up and sob for 5 minutes, but I managed to push through. And I was talking about some of the things that we wanted to remember about 9/11 because we're hearing a lot of things from people like we shouldn't talk about it. And Slate, a college professor today, said we don't need to memorialize 9/11. These students have enough on their minds without sitting around just worrying about things that happened before their lifetime. Joe Scarborough today wrote an article in the Washington Post. I'll just read you the headline: Trump is damaging the dream of America more than any terrorist attack ever could. So you can tell that people on the left are sort of seizing this moment to sink as low as they possibly can and kind of making this an unimportant day. But it's not. It's not an unimportant day, and remembering things is not unimportant. I was thinking as I was speaking this morning about Lincoln's first inaugural address. When, you know, there can be many arguments about who was the greatest American president, but there can be no argument about who was the greatest writer who was American president. It was Abraham Lincoln. And in his first inaugural address, he was begging the South not to pull away from America, not to start a civil war. And at the end, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Just such beautiful language, the mystic chords being played by our better angels. Well, the mystic chords of memory are in fact very mysterious. I mean, memory is what makes us who we are. It's how we know that we're the same person we were yesterday. It's how we build a picture of our personality from the moment we're born until the day we die. And I think it is true not just of individuals, it's true of our nation. And that's why I think it's so important. Guys like this professor writing in Slate saying we shouldn't remember things. I travel around with YAF to different colleges, and I find a lot of kids are being taught nothing. They're being taught nothing about how our government works, about where it comes from, about why we think the things we do, why we believe the things we do. And, you know, they're also being told histories that emphasize the worst things about this country. I mean, the bad things that happened in this country, as they have in all country. And I always tell them that is as if I told your biography starting with your porn searches online. You know, that's, you know, you say, who is Bob? Well, let me tell you this, because this will really grab you. And by the time I'm finished, you think he's a horrible person when he really is. It's really not the bad things that we all do. It's the good things we do in this country has transformed the world for the better. There's not a single person politically free walking on the earth who does not owe a debt of gratitude to America. I mean, that is just a mathematical fact. We have really freed the world and taught the world what freedom means. All these people making speeches in Europe about how they're multicultural countries, which they're not, got that from us. I mean, they are imitating us. Even the Soviet Union, a slave state, felt compelled to call themselves the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics because everybody knew that we had gotten it right, except us, because we were admiring the USSR. We were saying, oh, yes, that's wonderful. So these memories remind us who we are. And I want to talk a little bit about my own memories of 9/11 and three things I learned from 9/11. And you may be surprised to hear that some of these are a little politically incorrect. But when 9/11 happened, I had only been back in this country a year. I had left to go to England for a year and had stayed for 7 years. So I was an expatriate. And I had this tremendous experience living overseas for 7 years, a long time, which was kind of like when the astronauts went to the moon and they took that picture of Earth and they saw it at a distance. And so for 6.5 of the 7 years, all I paid attention to was English politics. That's all I knew. I knew English people, read English news, was involved in English politics. The Bill Clinton scandals were going on. And of course, that was part of the English news, so I knew about it, but I wasn't in the country for any of that. And when I came back and I moved here to Santa Barbara, I found that my opinions had changed, And as a guy who had grown up in a liberal Democrat family where there were Republicans and then there were Nazis. And the separation was like this, that was really the way. If a Republican got elected president, my father was packing gold bars into a suitcase so he could bribe his way through the border to Canada. And so I came back, and to my shock, I found that the people who were saying what I was saying in America were Rush Limbaugh, the guys at the corner in National Review. Nazis, these evil conservatives, were saying what I thought had learned to be true about America from seeing it from very far away. And then I was here 1 year, I guess, and 9/11 happened. And I remember waking up, and you have to understand that my entire family lives on the island of Manhattan. Now, one of them has moved to the Bronx, but they all are New Yorkers, and they've all lived in Manhattan all their lives. And so I wake up 3,000 miles away, and I hear that a plane has gone into the World Trade Center. And the first thing I thought of was I remembered reading that in 1945, a military plane had crashed accidentally into the Empire State Building. And so that was the picture in my mind when I turned on the TV and saw what had really happened. And of course, I started calling my family, and one by one, I had 3 brothers and my father and mother. And I remember my father, who's now gone, but at the time he was sobbing. And I will tell you that the one thing you never want to hear in this life is your father sobbing. You do not want to hear that sound. And I remember, he thought, this is war. We're now at war. And I remember saying to him, it's not going to be a big war like World War II. It's going to be a lot of little wars because there's no nation to fight. We're fighting this philosophy. We're fighting a philosophy. And that was the first lesson. That was the first lesson I remember, is that we're fighting a philosophy. And so much of human life is about philosophy. So much of history is about ideas, a battle over ideas. And that was why it was my last stage in becoming an actual open conservative. I was already a conservative, but this was my last stage in acknowledging it, because I saw liberals asking the question. I remember David Letterman going on TV after this happened and asking the question, why do they hate us? Now, I've volunteered on a lot of suicide hotlines, on a couple of suicide hotlines. And every now and again, you speak to a wife whose husband is violent and who hits her. And a lot of times, the woman will say to you, what am I doing wrong? What can I do to stop him from hitting me? And of course, I wasn't allowed to say it. My answer was, shoot him, that'll stop him, So like when I heard David Letterman say, why do they hate us? My first reaction was, well, let's kill him and see if that solves the problem. That would be the fastest thing to do, because they're not acting because of us. That's demeaning to our enemies. It's demeaning to our enemies to think that we have some power to make them change their minds. We don't. They are grown-up adults just like us, and they're acting on their ideas as we are acting on our ideas. And that is why when I was working in the movie business at the time and selling a lot of scripts, I write mysteries and ghost stories. But that's why when I saw Hollywood start to turn out these films in which our soldiers were depicted as rapists and killers and idiots who were being abused by evil Republicans and sent into war where they were risking their lives for nothing, that's why I became an outspoken conservative, effectively ending my Hollywood career, because I realized our culture is where we store these ideas that are lived ideas, our movies. Not only did I think it was wrong to make anti-American films while our guys were at war, which was the real reason that made me so angry I started speaking out, but also this is the way these films last forever. These films last forever. They're on at 3 o'clock in the morning, and this is the way young people will remember these things. And that's why I was so glad when American Sniper came out and told an honest version of the story. Not that we were perfect. This is not about the fact that we're better people than they are. It's the fact that bad ideas make cultures bad. Bad ideas make people do horrible things. And good ideas ennoble people and lift them up. The second lesson I learned is this. And here's where we get into things that make you uncomfortable, make some people uncomfortable. Religion matters, even if your religion is atheism. Elites and intellectuals were shocked at 9/11 that anybody could be so primitive as to care enough about God to commit an act of suicide killing. It had been happening all around them, but they couldn't believe it. They thought that in the natural order of things, we were all going to grow out of this primitive idea that there's some big bearded man up in the sky, running things. And oh my goodness, what a silly thing that you would think about this. This 9/11 happened before I became a Christian, but already I had come to understand that there must be a God. If all the logic of life was to work itself out and make sense, I had begun to believe in God, but I hadn't become a Christian yet. And when I watched this, I thought, what culture, what nation, what people has not been shaped at the deepest level by its concept of who God is? I mean, when we say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that implies an idea of a Creator. That implies an idea of what the Creator wants. I'll tell you something. The people who flew those planes into those buildings and into the Pentagon, and who tried to fly it into other buildings in Washington, they and I agree on one thing. We agree on the idea that the government is meant to enforce the will of God. They think the will of God is that you should be slaves. I think you should be free, and that the government is there to ensure that you are free, to ensure the rights God gave you are put in place. There's no getting out of that. There's no getting out of that conflict. I mean, that is a conflict in two ways of looking at the world. And when you point out to people who are so advanced and have gotten so far in their intellectual journey that they realize this God stuff is all primitive nonsense, and you say, well, what about the communists? The communists in China and in Russia enforced atheism and slaughtered more people in about 20 minutes than all the religious wars on earth had ever slaughtered anybody, right? Their answer is always, Sam Harris, the big atheist guy, says this, well, communism is a religion too. Communism is a religion too, but communism is not a religion. Communism is not a religion. Atheism is the religion of communism, and it must be, because it is completely a materialist way of thought. So, when you look at people who are atheists, that is also a religion. It's a way of confronting the unknown, the eternal, your creation. Now, I read a lot of scientific books, and a lot of scientific books that come out now put forward the idea that science has taken us beyond the idea of God, and that has consequences. Let me read you a book. It's called, read you a little portion of a book called Sapiens, a little portion of an interview with the author, Yuval Harari. Sapiens is a huge bestseller. Bill Gates thinks it's the most brilliant thing ever. And it's all about the fact that we are human beings because we tell these fictions, untrue stories, and they bind us together. And Harari says, if you think about human rights are a fictional story, just like God and heaven. They are not a biological reality. Biologically speaking, humans don't have rights. If you take Homo sapiens and look inside, you find the heart and the kidneys and the DNA. You don't find any rights. The only place rights exist is in the stories that people have been inventing. If you don't believe in God, that is absolutely right. That is absolutely true. But I am a fiction writer. I'm a writer of stories, and stories are not made up. There are ways of communicating truths that you can't say in any other way. We all do it. We all use metaphors to say, what was it like to pitch a no-hitter? You say, well, it was like waking up on Christmas morning, because there's no words. There's no words to say what it's like, what the experience of being a human being is like. So we write stories, and we use art to communicate these things. So when you write a story, the question is the story true? Is the story true? And that is the question that Yuval Harari doesn't have to ask. But if we lived in Yuval Harari's world, where human rights were a fiction, how hard is it to guess? How hard is it to guess what that world is going to look like about 10 seconds after it gets founded, right? Because how do you defend your rights? How do you defend your rights if they're just a fiction? He has a better fiction. His fiction is that the world is going to end through climate change, and so you have to give up your rights. His fiction is something else. The question is not whether we're telling stories. Of course we're telling stories. There's no way to communicate the essential facts of life without telling stories, but are the stories true? And that is really the question we're asking. Harari's religion is atheism, so is Steven Pinker, another science writer that I like, and so he thinks our rights are a fiction. But I believe, and I think, I don't have to quote the Bible, I believe in a God who made us in his image and wants us to be free. And I don't have to quote the Bible to prove that, because I think all of nature cries it out. All of the human heart cries it out. So The objection to this, the thing that makes people so upset when you start talking about religion, is they say, well, wait, are we going to have holy wars? Are we going to have holy wars? Is that we're going to go back to the world of holy wars? I remember I was judging a journalistic contest, and I was on the phone with other journalists who were also judges in this contest. And one of these women, a very big, I won't give her away, but it was a very big journalist, and she said, I heard that George W. Bush prayed before he went into Iraq. So this is just a holy war. He's no better than bin Laden. Bin Laden prays to his God and George W. Bush prays to his God. What's the difference? Well, that's a good question. What's the difference? If the difference is our God wants us to be free and their God wants to enslave us, that's a big difference. So I never want to attack anybody because of his religion. Not anybody. I never want to fight with anybody because of his religion. But if somebody attacks me because of his God, I do want to fight back. And I do want to fight back in the knowledge that freedom is better than slavery. Why is freedom better than slavery? Because we are created beings with God-given rights. And the third one, and you're going to love this one, the third lesson I got from 9/11 is that men must be men or the world comes crashing down. Now, whenever you speak in praise of manhood now, there's always somebody who says, well, a woman could do that. And here's my answer. No, she couldn't. A woman could do it. But if men abandon their posts, if men abandon the rules of manhood, which require bravery, which require sacrifice, which require standing up for the women in our lives, the world comes crashing down. And this is a good time to stop for a minute and remember the men of 9/11, the firefighters and police, and this is something I can barely keep in my head, who charged into the buildings as they were crumbling to get people out. Without men like that, the world comes tumbling down. I want to remember, I should remember the Engine 54 Ladder 4 Battalion 9 in Midtown lost 15 men that day, okay? I mean, the engine companies are not that big. You visit, I don't know if you've been to New York, anywhere, even in big city, they're not that big. 15 men is a huge, huge number. Talk about Tom Burnett, Mark Bingham, Jeremy Glick, and Todd Beamer, who took back United 93 and drove it into the ground before it could reach what they think it was. They think it was DC. What made those guys so American, such American men, is not that they had courage. All kinds of people have courage. But that they broke the rules when new information came in. That was an incredibly American thing to do. The rules, the thing that people were trained to do when a plane was hijacked, was to let the hijackers do what they want. They were just going to fly to Miami, park the plane, get their ransom or whatever, and let everybody go. So there was no point in fighting back and getting killed. But one of these guys, Tom Burnett, was on the phone with his wife, Dina, and she said, that's not what's happening. They're hijacking planes all over. They're crashing them into buildings. And they decided that they were going to take back the plane. An amazing act of courage. Without men like that, the world comes crashing down. I mean, I could go through so many, but I also want to mention Chris Stevens and Sean Smith and Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, who died 9/11/2012 in Benghazi. These ideas that we hold, these ideas that come from our God. Because of these ideas, there's certain things you can't have. If you want people to be free, you can't be equal. Because if you're free, you're going to be better at something than me. Maybe I'll be better at something than you. If you're free, people are going to rise at different levels. So you can't be equal. You can't have equal outcomes. But if you want to be free, you can't be always at peace. You have to fight sometimes. Because people want to enslave you. That's human nature. People want to enslave you, and some people want to give up their freedom because it's too much trouble. Without men to fight those battles, you will not be free for long, and the world will come crashing down. And today, and I'll talk about this later on at the end of the show, because we've had a huge, in Hollywood, we've had a huge bout of Me Too toxic masculinity, but we hear all the time about toxic masculinity. And believe me, like I said, I work in Hollywood, I see a lot of toxic masculinity, all right? But on 9/11, I think we should remember what real masculinity looks like and how much we owe it. How much we owe to the men who fulfill the roles of men, And I think that is the third thing I took away from 9/11. We're not all soldiers, we're not all firemen, we're not all policemen, we're not all heroes. But I do believe that each and every one of us have a little piece of this beautiful idea in our hands, and we have to defend it with all the courage we have, no matter how they shout at us, no matter how they scream at us. And I think ultimately that there's going to have to be a phalanx of men who stand for these things and hold them up, because that's the only way that they'll survive. So that is what I take away from 9/11. In the end, we can't remember pain. It's a really interesting thing about the human mind. We can't remember pain. If we could actually remember pain, no woman would ever have a second child. I mean, you forget how bad it is, and you go back into the fray. And because we can't remember pain, all of history eventually becomes literature. That means all of history eventually becomes a story that we tell. And we have to tell that story, and we have to tell it truthfully, and we have to remember, because there are always people willing to tell stories that aren't true, stories that promote bad values, stories that promote bad ideas. And we stand on a tower of great ideas. And as I said in my speech this morning, that tower is still standing, and we have to never let it fall.